Give the call to the member for Hughes.
This month marks 28 years from one of the great but little-known turning points of world history. It happened in September 1989 when Boris Yeltsin, the then newly elected member of the Soviet Parliament and Supreme Soviet, was visiting Houston in the USA as part of the US and Russians' joint planned International Space Station. After he'd made his visit to the space station facilities, he made an unplanned stop at a small grocery store called Randall's. And the rumour goes that he was there because he wanted to buy a bottle of vodka. Going to an unplanned stop, he knew that this couldn't be a setup. He knew that he would be walking into a typical American supermarket. And what he saw, someone that was used to the breadlines and queues of the Soviet Union, changed his perspective on life. In his own autobiography, he wrote about the experience which shattered his views of socialism. He said, and I quote, "When I saw those shelves crammed with hundreds of thousands of cans, cartons and goods of every possible sort, for the first time I felt frankly sick with despair for the Soviet people. That such a potential super-rich country as ours, being Russia, has been brought to such a state of poverty, it is terrible to think." One of Yeltsin's aides later said that at that grocery store, the last vestiges of Bolshevism collapsed inside his boss. Leon Aaron, quoting a Yeltsin associate, said of Yeltsin after his visit, "For a while, a long time, on the plane to Miami, he sat motionless, his head in his hands. He said, 'What have they done to our poor people?' After a long silence, he added, on his return to Moscow, Yeltsin would confess that the pain he had felt after the Houston excursion, the pain for all of us, for a country so rich, so talented and so exhausted by incessant experiments." Yeltsin later wrote that, "I think we have committed a crime against our people by making their standard of living so incomparably lower than the Americans." It was 2 years later that Yeltsin famously climbed on top of a Red Army tank and faced down reactionary forces that were threatening to overthrow Mr. Gorbachev. No one would know what would have happened to history if Boris Yeltsin didn't have that bravery that he obviously had installed from his visit to that US supermarket, where he realised that the collapse of the Soviet system, the differences in the effects of the real lives of people between a capitalist system and a socialist system. This is a historic day that we should remember, and Speaker, this is the actual photograph of that event, which is a very historic photograph that should be more known and actually taught in our schools.
I thank the member for Hughes.